Left of the box. This story is from 2021 in May. Now, that date might not seem significant, but this was early on. So the COVID pandemic had been going on for about a year. A report had finally been made after some horrific findings. You see, here in Ontario and in Quebec, we have long-term health care homes that are both publicly and privately run. Those privately run long-term care homes were so bad during the pandemic that they had to call in the military to get things under control when the outbreaks first started. When the military arrived at these homes, this is content warning here, they found 26 people had died of dehydration. Seniors, people with disabilities, trapped in their beds, who weren't able to just leave their bed to go get a cup of water. And reports saying that all they needed was a wash and water and they would have been still alive. But they were abandoned through the confusion, through lack of pay, through the lack of organization, all of that stuff. And so this is here just a little bit of a reminder of the situation there. And some of the military personnel that went to these homes actually ended up with PTSD from what they found there. Just absolutely horrific. And of course, Doug Ford wants to continue privatizing things in Ontario because what's the worst that could happen? A little bit of a reminder. The Canadian military claims that more than 24 residents at Toronto long-term care home died due to dehydration prior to the arrival amid the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, while feces and vomit were reportedly found on the floors and walls of another, according to a newly obtained report. The document, which were submitted to Ontario Long-Term Care Home Commission and referenced in their final report on April 30th, described heartbreaking and horrifying conditions within two of the Toronto facilities. Among the most startling claims are allegations of neglect, malnutrition, and suggestion that COVID-19 deaths at one home paled in comparison to general deaths. So that's just a bit of a reminder of that story. And I covered this subject a lot when it was first happening through my video essays, because to me, the whole situation was just horrifying beyond belief, like incomprehensibly horrifying. The thought of being trapped in your bed, pulling on the emergency cord to get help and nobody coming, simply because you needed water. Or to have a roommate in your room beside you dying and there's nothing that you can do. Again, just horrifying. But then do you know what Doug Ford did? Well, he passed legislation making it so that people, the family members of these victims, couldn't sue these long-term care homes for damages done during COVID. Then he also gave Mike Harris, former Premier of Ontario, who did a horrible job here, privatized, defunded. He was the start of the absolute insane housing crisis that we have. Well, he gave Mike Harris the Order of Ontario. Now, why is that important? Because Mike Harris is a shareholder of one of these long-term care homes. So instead of getting punished, laws were put in place to protect him. He was given the Order of Ontario. Oh, right. And hundreds of millions of dollars went to the shareholders of these homes. And I was worried that there would be no accountability to that. But there might be after all. 6 Ontario long-term care providers face class action lawsuits for alleged gross negligence during pandemic. Companies accused of inadequate care that resulted in avoidable COVID-19 deaths. Class action lawsuit against 6 of Ontario's largest for-profit long-term care LTC home providers claiming gross negligence that led to illness and death during the COVID-19 pandemic have been allowed to proceed. This is good. In a ruling last week, the Ontario Superior Court of Justice certified class action suits against Sienna Rivera, all of these, including Chartwell, which is the one that Mike Harris is on the board of shareholders or whatever. The separate class actions were filed on behalf of thousands of clients, family members, and visitors who alleged the companies were unprepared to provide care during the pandemic and failed to protect the health of residents and visitors. There were many homes in Ontario that didn't have a problem, but these were the worst offenders from our perspective, said Joel, one of the lead lawyers for the plaintiffs. We alleged that their conduct fell far below any reasonable standard. And if you looked at all the statistics back then of death by COVID in privatized long-term care homes versus public long-term care homes, there was a stark difference. The people in the private long-term care homes were they were being knocked out. Like a wave of COVID would go in and wipe out dozens of people. It was so horrific what was happening in these long-term privatized care homes. At the height of the pandemic in 2020, the quick spread of COVID-19 through long-term care homes led the province to ask the military for help, staff struggling to provide care. That led to a scathing military report about living conditions in some of these homes. From March 2020 to April 2022, 4,335 residents died in Ontario long-term care homes, according to a September report from the province's ombudsman. In their court submissions, the plaintiffs' counsel said at least 3,300 of those deaths were in long-term care homes owned and operated by the defendants. So in 6 homes of the 4,335 people, nearly 3,000 died in those 6 homes of all the long-term care home deaths. That is, yeah. In certifying the class actions, the court considered expert opinions provided by the plaintiffs that defendants have fallen short of providing reasonable infection control and prevention during the pandemic. The plaintiffs claimed the majority of COVID-related residents' deaths at long-term care homes were preventable. Inhibiting the long-term care home industry from repeating any mistakes is a significant goal of this class action that would be diluted if the individual claims were pursued in its place, wrote Justice E.M. Morgan in the court's decision to allow the class action to proceed. Provincial legislation passed in 2020 provides liable protections to businesses from COVID-19 exposure-related lawsuits, but doesn't protect bad actors from endangering others willfully through gross negligence. And that is where the difference is. So in 2020, the first legislation was pushed through to protect these places from lawsuits against them for damages done during COVID-19. And many people from survivors, friends of victims, friends and families of victims thought that this meant that they wouldn't be able to hold these long-term care homes accountable for what they did. But it turns out that that legislation doesn't protect them if what they did was just so grossly negligent it led to their deaths. Class actions will bring long-awaited justice, advocate. 2 other pending class action suits against the independent long-term care companies and municipally owned long-term care facilities were also considered, but the court decided not to certify them, citing lack of representative plaintiffs and cause for action. That doesn't mean plaintiffs in those proposed class actions don't have valid grievances, said the long-term care advocate, Vivian, a professor and researcher at Ontario Tech University. She says she hopes these grievances can be addressed through other legal avenues. She says that she's happy that these actions will go ahead. I have been vehemently against the profit motive in long-term care, she said in an interview. They had the vast majority of deaths. They were clearly shown in numbers in numerous investigations to fail compared to nonprofits. She says these class actions will finally give families the chance to seek justice for the avoidable loss of their loved ones. I just really hope that you know that when they have their day in court, that they establish what we all saw unfold, she said, which was the massive, widespread, often preventable negligence that resulted in far too many unnecessary deaths and just trauma that will live with these families for the rest of their lives. So the certification of these lawsuits came less than a month after the Ontario Court of Appeal upheld ruling to allow class action against Ontario long-term care minister to proceed. And just wanted to point out from Twitter here. Yeah, so big step. The Ontario Superior Court gives green light, and just somebody reminding me of some of the horrific conditions there. Tori saying, I will never forget the senior who died with necrosis from bed sores that went down to the shin bone in a Chartwell home, which Mike Harris sits on the board of, and Doug Ford awarded him the Order of Ontario. I hope they lose everything. I hope these homes lose all of their money. There should not be private, for-profit, long-term care homes in this country.